Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the motion in the name of Mr. Vikram Nair and as amended by Mr. Alex Young. This conflict occurs thousands of kilometers away and has a long, complicated, and often violent history going back thousands of years. But all Singaporeans are horrified, are saddened by this latest escalation of the Israel-Hamas conflict. Anyone with a heart must feel pain when we witness the suffering of fellow human beings, regardless of race, language, religion, ideology, or allegiance. Early on the morning of the 7th of October 2023, Hamas launched several thousand rockets into Israel. At the same time, more than 1,000 militants infiltrated Israeli territory and killed more than 1,400 persons. The victims included innocent civilians at home, many of them asleep, young people attending a concert, and several of our fellow ASEAN nationals working on farms. Hamas also abducted more than 200 civilians, including senior citizens, women, and children, who today are held as hostages in Gaza. Let me be clear and unambiguous. What Hamas did on the 7th of October was an act of terrorism. And it involved indiscriminate killing and extreme brutality. It was not a military operation targeted at military targets. And such acts cannot be justified by any rationale, any historical grievance, any religious belief, any context. These acts of indiscriminate killing, torture, and kidnapping of innocent civilians are acts of terror, period. And this is why Singapore has strongly condemned the terrorist attack by Hamas and why we have called for the safe, immediate, and unconditional release of all civilian hostages. It is in our absolute national interest to hold fast to this stand, not just because we feel sorry for innocent victims, but because our national interests are at stake. Being so small, exposed, vulnerable, multiracial, Singapore must take a clear and unambiguous stand against terrorism in all circumstances. I was somewhat reassured when I listened to the leader of opposition's speech just now, where he now seems to have clarified that the attack that was launched by Hamas was not simply a military operation, but in fact deserves to be condemned. I think Mr. Gerald Giam was even more specific. I think you used the word unequivocally condemn the attacks by Hamas. I couldn't help noticing that both members of the Workers' Party were unable to use the word terrorism. I will leave that for you to clarify later on. But I must share with you that when I first saw your published statement, it left room for ambiguity. I think your speeches in this chamber today are more reassuring, but I would feel even better if you can clearly and unequivocally say indiscriminate attacks on civilians, on women, on children, and taking hostages is a clear and present act of terror, and say that for the sake of Singapore and Singaporeans. These attacks have obviously deeply shaken the Israeli sense of safety and security. And we now know that Israel has responded by launching an intensive aerial bombardment of Gaza. It imposed a blockade on the delivery of food, water, and fuel supplies. On the 28th of October, Israeli troops expanded their ground operations in Gaza to destroy the Hamas military capacity and its vast network of underground tunnels, much of which it is alleged to be located under civilian infrastructure, including schools and hospitals. Israel's intensive bombardment and the blockade has caused a massive humanitarian crisis in Gaza. To date, health authorities in Gaza have estimated that more than 9,000 Palestinians, including many women and children in Gaza, have died. Many more have suffered injuries, and over 1.5 million would have been displaced from their homes and without adequate shelter, food, water, or medical attention. At the 10th UN General Assembly Emergency Special Session on the 27th of October, Singapore voted for a humanitarian truce so that immediate and sustained humanitarian provision of essential supplies and services to civilians throughout the Gaza Strip can be provided. I think you have a copy of that resolution that we voted for, including the explanation of vote by our permanent representative, Mr. Burhan Ghafur, which again made the point that there were glaring omissions in that resolution. To call out Hamas for conducting an act of terror and for not acknowledging the right of self-defense on the part of Israel, which I will explain a little bit more later on. So, Mr. Speaker, let me take this opportunity to explain the principles underpinning the Singapore government's position on this unfolding tragedy. First, Singapore must always take a zero-tolerance approach towards terrorism. We have to be categorical in rejecting terrorism, whoever, whenever, wherever it is perpetrated. And as I said just now, we do so not just out of sympathy, but because terrorism is a clear and present danger and threat for Singapore and Singaporeans. Second point, international law dictates that all states have a legitimate and inherent right to defend themselves. This is enshrined in Article 51 of the UN Charter. I don't think I need to remind this House that this is a very important principle for Singapore. And have no doubt, if Singapore is ever attacked, we would certainly assert and exercise the right of self-defense. Third point, all countries must ensure that if military action is taken in exercising this right of self-defense, they must abide by the principles of necessity and proportionality. And they must also comply with the laws of war, including the principle of distinction and humanity enshrined in the Geneva Conventions. In such times like this, it is crucial that decisions are not made out of anger, blind wrath, and hatred, but are made in line with moral values and legal principles that shape our common humanity. In a jointly written Financial Times commentary last month, a group of distinguished Jewish jurists, and these include experts in international humanitarian law, they strongly counseled Israel and its leaders to act in a restrained and thoughtful way that would not make the country's problems worse. One of these jurists, in fact, included Lord David Newberg, who was the former president of the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom. It is worth quoting them, and let me quote one whole paragraph in full. Quote, "International law forbids the sieges of civilian populations. Gaza is home to some 2 million fellow human beings, almost half of whom are children. And it would be a grave violation of international law to hold them under siege and while doing so deprive them of basic necessities such as food and water. To be clear, collective punishment is prohibited by the laws of war. Equally, international law requires combatants to ensure minimum destruction to civilian life and infrastructure. And intent to cause indiscriminate damage rather than behaving in a precise manner to minimize damage would, if established, constitute a grave violation of international law. In the conduct of any military campaign, politicians and commanders alike must be careful to ensure that their words do not imply to their troops that the laws of war can be disregarded, nor employ language whose effect is to dehumanize a civilian population." Unquote. I want to emphasize the last sentence, to dehumanize a civilian population, because usually that is a very clear indication that conflict between countries, states, or civilizations is about to begin. And the moment that human beings can dehumanize the other is the time when unspeakable horror, barbarity, and terrorism is conducted. Any alleged violation of international humanitarian law in this conflict should therefore be investigated in accordance with international law. I think MP Zulkarnain had asked that question earlier. Yes, we will support the investigation of all allegations after the war in accordance with international law. And we hope that all parties will cooperate in these investigations. History will judge each party's response, not only by whether and how immediate threats are resolved, but also by the effects on the long-term stability and security of the region. Fourth point, humanitarian assistance must reach the affected civilian populations immediately. And that's why we call on all parties to enable this, and particularly Israel and Egypt, which have immediate borders with the Gaza. Yesterday, I spoke to the Egyptian Foreign Minister, Sameh Shoukry. Frankly, he was tired, almost demoralized. I told him Singapore understands the tremendous strain that Egypt, as an immediate neighbor, faces. I said we want to support you. We have our people in Singapore care. We are raising funds, and let us know how we can assist Egypt. I commended the Egyptian government's efforts to open the Rafah crossing to facilitate the flow of humanitarian goods into Gaza, and equally the possible evacuation of seriously injured persons for medical treatment. The day before, I had spoken to the foreign minister of the UAE, who was also trying to work out plans, perhaps, to evacuate injured children and their families for treatment elsewhere. We strongly support all these efforts by the immediate neighbors, as well as by the UN and all the other relief organizations to increase aid to Gaza. I think you all are aware that the Singapore government contributed seed funding of about $300,000 to the Singapore Red Cross, which is working with its partners to support the relief efforts in Gaza. And working closely with the Palestine Red Crescent Society, the Egyptian Red Crescent Society. In fact, right now, I think Singaporeans have donated nearly $5 million to the fundraising drives by the Singapore Red Cross and the Rahmatan Lil Alamin Foundation. In fact, I'm sure more will come in the weeks to come. I think later tonight, Dr. Maliki will be leaving. He will be going to Cairo, and he will also help to ensure facilitation and that the goodness of the hearts of Singaporeans will be directed through the right channels. He will explain a little bit more after my speech. Fifth point, Singapore continues to uphold our long-standing and consistent position that a negotiated two-state solution, consistent with UN Security Council resolutions, especially 242 and 338, that a two-state solution is the only viable option for a comprehensive, just, and durable solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We have consistently stated for a long time that Israel must accept a Palestinian state, just as Palestinians must also accept Israel's right to exist. We have expressed our firm opposition to violations of international law and to unilateral measures which imperil the prospects for peace. Now, many of you know we've got good relations with Israel. I hope you also know we have good relations with the Palestinian people and with the Palestinian Authority. But look at our voting record in the United Nations. During the Six-Day War in 1967, Israeli forces occupied the old city of Jerusalem and parts of the West Bank after Jordan attacked Israel. Following the war, so this is 1967, before some members in this House were not born yet. In 1967, following the war, we voted in support of all the UN General Assembly resolutions calling on Israel to rescind unilateral measures taken to change the status of Jerusalem. We voted again like this in 2017. And we have also voted in support of UN General Assembly resolutions that reject Israeli settlement activities in the West Bank. With your permission, Mr. Speaker, can I ask the clerk to distribute a list illustrating Singapore's past voting positions at the United Nations. Members can also access the handout through the app.
Please proceed.
Thank you. So the point is, we are good friends, but good friends also speak truth, even if it's disagreeable and not the most comfortable to the person on the other side. And our ability to speak truth to friends and to be friends to both sides, even while they are locked in mortal conflict, is a privileged position, but one that can only be maintained if we are consistent and we operate on the basis of principles. Now, unfortunately, the peace process in both Israel and Palestine, and you heard a good synopsis on the history of Mr. Vikram Nair in his opening speech. I hope you paid attention to it. But the upshot of all that process, so first I would remind all of you, being a peacemaker in the Middle East is dangerous. You mentioned President Anwar Sadat. When he made peace with Israel in Camp David, I think they signed it in 1978. By 1981, he was assassinated. In Israel, then Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, whom in fact was the IDF Chief of Staff during the 1967 war. So this is no dove. This is a realist, a general, a commander, a soldier. Mr. Vikram Nair reminded us that it was Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat who signed the Oslo Accords in 93, and subsequently a second round in 95. And in fact, this is what has led to the creation of the Palestinian Authority. It led to the Israelis pulling out of Gaza. But you all will know he was assassinated in November 1999. Not by an Arab, but by an Israeli extremist. As for the Palestinians, the Palestinian Authority consisted initially of the PLO, because in fact the Oslo Accords provided that for the first time ever, the PLO recognized Israel's right to exist, and the Israelis recognized the PLO as a representative of the Palestinians. But soon, fierce political rivalry between Hamas and Fatah occurred. And in fact, it wasn't just a matter of elections and you win and I win. It was actually civil war, violence. And they killed each other. The rise of the radical, hard-right extremists in both societies, in fact, have made a peaceful political settlement almost impossible. You know, we sit here or stand here and talk about a two-state solution, but we are talking. That's where the front line is. And actually, support for a two-state negotiated political solution has been dropping, waning in both those societies. In fact, in a very perverse way, the extremists, right wing, in both Israel and amongst the Palestinians, believe in a one-state solution. But if you think about it, a one-state solution, by definition, means the violent elimination of the other. So, making the point, this is difficult, this is complicated, and we should respect that difficulty. Nevertheless, it is our sincere hope that over time, both sides will muster the political will. In fact, I should digress, they need the political leadership with the conviction, the courage, and the political capital which they are willing to expend in order to make a two-state solution a reality. And if they don't, then they are doomed to repeated cycles of violence. So in the meantime, we will continue to engage the Palestinian Authority. We will support their capacity building efforts through the Enhanced Technical Assistance Package. We have regular high-level exchanges and visits with the Palestinian Authority, which have allowed us to meet them, hear them, discuss issues with them candidly. The Prime Minister, Mohammed Shtayyeh, visited Singapore last year, whilst Prime Minister Lee, Senior Minister Teo, Minister Maliki, and I have visited Ramallah. In fact, on more than one occasion. And we opened our Singapore representative office in Ramallah in 2022. My sixth point is that we must not allow external political events, painful as they are, we must not allow these external events to divide us in Singapore. Yesterday, the Prime Minister reminded us, this is not our quarrel. This is a quarrel amongst our friends outside. And our job is to be sympathetic, to be compassionate, to speak truth to them, to be helpful, but not to pour oil on a fire. And bear in mind, actually both sides claim to be the children of Abraham. This is the ultimate example of sibling fratricide. Both sides have suffered tragic losses, and they deserve our sympathy and support. But come back now to Singapore and be very, very wary and careful in how we reflect our compassion, our principles, our values. Understand that strong emotions are engaged, but we must not fall prey to what we see in other countries where strong emotions have led to violent clashes, to hate speech, and to exclusion. And as many of you have illustrated, often fueled by disinformation. And our religious and racial harmony is very precious. We must not allow anything to break this or split our society. And it is heartening that so many of our faith and community leaders strongly feel this, say this, and operate on this basis. Our Muslim community in particular have responded in a very restrained, responsible, and responsive manner, working in concert with other communities to collectively raise funds for humanitarian assistance for the Palestinian civilians in Gaza. The Mufti, Dr. Naziruddin Nasir, wrote a letter which I hope every single one of you will read. He wrote a letter to express solidarity and support to the Rabbi Abigail, who replied in the same spirit. It was an exemplary gesture of goodwill. It reflects so well on our religious harmony, but it's actually quite rare in the world for a mufti and a rabbi to be able to, at a moment of tension and high emotion, to correspond like that. And I can assure you, government had nothing to do with this. But we saw it, we approved it, and we should all be grateful to them. Let me also make a secondary point here, that it is worth emphasizing that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not a religious conflict. At its core, the conflict has always been about territory, self-determination, identity, and complicated by intra-Palestinian and intra-Israeli domestic politics. And as I said before, it provides fertile ground for extremists on both sides to misuse religion to further their political aims. And we must not fall into that trap. The seventh point is that the safety of Singaporeans abroad is always a priority for us in MFA. On the 7th of October, we advised Singaporeans to leave Israel and the Palestinian territories as soon as possible. We reached out to Singaporeans who had registered with MFA, and we facilitated the departure of those who needed assistance. But even today, you might be surprised to know that 40 registered Singaporeans remain in Israel and the Palestinian territories. We do our best to remain in contact with them. They have chosen to remain. More than 120 other Singaporeans heeded our advice and left by land or air earlier. Whilst most Singaporeans were able to leave by commercial means, a few who were unable to do so departed via dedicated evacuation flights, which were organized by other countries. And I need to express our gratitude to the governments of Australia, Canada, Portugal, and Korea for helping our Singaporeans to leave Israel safely. Mr. Speaker, this latest conflagration is just the most recent episode of a complex, long-running conflict in the Middle East. As human beings, we cannot remain detached and inured to human suffering. But we know these cycles of violence will recur unless they come to the nub of the problem. So as Singaporeans, we do care, and we do care deeply. But this episode is also a reminder to all Singaporeans that we do have our national interests at stake. What are they? We must reject terrorism in all its forms. No excuses, no ifs, no buts, no short-term political advantage. Reject terrorism. If attacked, all of us here must give the government of the day the ability to exercise the right of self-defense. But even when it does so, we will expect the government of the day to uphold international law. And as Singaporeans, we will continue to extend humanitarian assistance and protection to all civilians. We should support the peaceful resolution of disputes. And we must nurture and protect our own precious cohesion and harmony. We must never allow conflicts elsewhere to divide us domestically. I am glad that today my sense of the House is that we have unanimity. We will have consensus in voting for this motion. And I make this appeal as Foreign Minister that our ability to conduct consistent and coherent foreign policy in a very volatile and dangerous world depends upon domestic cohesion and consensus. So I fully support this amended motion. I thank Mr. Vikram Nair, Mr. Alex Yam, and Mr. Zulkarnain Abdul Rahim, and I call on all MPs, regardless of party, to support this motion and to uphold these principles which are essential for Singapore's survival. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Pritam Singh.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise to clarify some remarks made by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, specifically his comment about the Workers' Party's statement of the 18th of October. I think Minister, correct me if I'm wrong, Minister was, for lack of a better word, curious why the word terrorist attack wasn't in our statement. The focus of our statement actually was to emphasize that whether it's Hamas, whether it's Israel, killing of non-combatants, women, children, by any country or organization deserves no less than absolute condemnation. I thought that would have made it clear that we were taking a very even-keeled approach to this matter. That on the one hand, the terrorist attacks are not to be condoned. On the other hand, when you have matters such as Israeli settlers evicting Palestinians from their homes in the West Bank, even today, it's happening today, that also ought to be condemned. I hope the Minister can agree that there has to be an even-handed approach to this. My second point, perhaps explaining why the use of that word terrorism wasn't activated so readily, but more a balanced approach in our statement was what we sought to put forward, is with regard to Singapore's approach on the labeling of organizations or terrorist designations on certain groups. So I understand Singapore is an inter-ministry committee on terrorist designation, IMCTD, and it is the authority of the designation of terrorist groups and groupings. The government relies on this committee to determine which organization is labeled accordingly. And then this is legislatively captured in the Terrorism Suppression of Financing Act 2002. My understanding, Hamas is not on that list. Maybe the Minister can explain that position for the understanding of the general public. My final point actually relates to something which was actually originally said by Mr. Alex Yam, and Minister also made the same point by way of his this document that has been released to members, where he said Singapore has been consistent in its stand on matters concerning Israel and Palestine. I take the point. But if I had a quick look at statements that were made by Mr. Lee Kuan Yew over the years. I referred to him in my speech. I also noted what he said in his memoirs, and he spoke of the Six-Day War, and I'm quoting from his memoirs. When the UN General Assembly was debating the resolution to condemn Israel, Rajaratnam, our foreign minister and Afro-Asian champion, was all for it. King Sui saw me to press Raja to direct our UN delegate not to vote in favor of the resolution, or the Israelis would leave. By Israelis would leave, he's referring to the Israeli advisors who were here in assisting the build-up of the Singapore Armed Forces. And thereafter, Mr. Lee says, as I could not attend the cabinet meeting, I stated my position in a note. We had to stand up for the right of small nations to exist. And he goes on, I added that I did not believe the Israeli advisors would leave even if we were to vote for the Afro-Asian resolution. I was in favor of abstaining in the vote. The cabinet agreed with my view. We abstained and the Israelis did not leave. So I just wanted to clarify, because the handout says voted yes for all these emergency special session resolutions. It may well be that the resolution Mr. Lee is referring to is a different one, but I'm just making that point to clarify what the minister has put out in his statement. Thank you.
Mr. Balakrishnan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I just want to, I suppose, double confirm. The actions that Hamas conducted on the 7th of October, targeting innocent civilians at home, killing women, children, and taking hostages, is the Workers' Party position that those are acts of terror? Okay, so I'll reflect that you have confirmed, and Gerald, same thing, they are acts of terror. So that's why I said I was more reassured after listening to both of you. Sorry, Mr. Speaker, I was reassured after listening to them because the initial statement did leave some room for doubt and ambiguity. My conclusion from this recent confirmation is that actually you stand foursquare with us and with the motion and with the government's position. And I want to welcome that because, again, foreign policy must stop. The arguments on foreign policy must stop at our shores. And on something as vital as terrorism, we cannot afford to have political parties trying to outflank each other in order to look to fish for votes. So I am grateful for the Workers' Party's confirmation that you stand on this issue, that what happened on that day was a terrorist act, deserves unequivocal condemnation, and I think the PSP has also made its position clear. Your second line of query is about terrorist designation. Generally, different countries have different ways of designating. The United States, the EU has its list of terrorist organizations. The UN generally works on the basis of what is designated by the Security Council. In Singapore, we do have a committee, and this is primarily a security committee, and it's direct. What we're looking out for are acts of terrorism, financing of terrorism, and whether someone or some organization is or isn't on a list in the UN or some other country is just one factor under consideration. You know, there's the old saying, if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it is a duck. I think I have to ask you to trust our security agencies that they know what activities and plans people are up to and where that money is going to, and we do not hesitate to act. So it's not a binary switch that you're on the list or you're not on the list. And you notice I've been also very careful to say what I'm asking you to confirm today is that the actions of 7th of October were acts of terror. If you want to go further back in history, I've made the point earlier that yes, it's not a secret that we do have a good relationship with Israel. But a good relationship does not mean we have to agree with everything they do, nor are we apologists for what they do. Specifically on the issues of occupied territories and settlements. As far as I know, I'll stand ready to be corrected, we have voted in favor of every resolution that has said that they should not be building settlements in occupied territories. And it's worth remembering, even to come back to Gaza, that in fact, 18 years ago, Israel had to deploy its own military forces in Gaza to force its settlers out of Gaza 18 years ago. I said just now, Maliki and I myself have been to Ramallah a couple of times. And yes, there is a problem in the West Bank because of the progressive settlements, which make it very difficult for any future settlement is concerned. So yes, Mr. Singh, we do vote regularly at the UN in a way which does not please the Israelis, but we have a good relationship based on respect. They know why we take the stand we take. The larger point I want to make to members of this House is that it's why it is so important to operate by principles and to consistently operate by principles, because from time to time, you will have, whoever's on this side of the House will have to say no. No to a superpower, no to a friend who has been there at a time when we were very vulnerable and needed help. But without that sense of principle and that consistent adherence to principle, we will make life much more difficult for our country, and the conduct of foreign policy, like I said, will become a very much more dangerous enterprise than it is now. Frankly, for this matter, the foreign policy aspects of it are not difficult. We know what to do, we know how to vote, we know what to say, we can put out correct statements. That's not rocket science. The real challenge, the real political challenge is domestic. And that's why I've been so keen on enlisting the support from MPs of all parties and from the NMPs as well for this motion.
Mr. Pritam Singh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to get a sense from the Minister, as I put in my original set of clarifications, how would he characterize what happens in the occupied territories? Because I think that's important for a more balanced perspective to this issue, and I think it's important that the government sets its view out as well.
Minister Balakrishnan.
I think I stated it just now, and I would put our voting record at the UN as Exhibit A. Our view is that those settlements should not be there. And if you go by the votes in the Security Council, they breach international law. So you don't need to ask me for that. That's on the record.